Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Tantra's Mantra where we go behind and beyond the tech news headlines. The mobile industry's biggest show, Mobile World Congress Barcelona, concluded a couple of weeks ago. After 2 years of subdued virtual event, it was a physical event this year, trying to get back to its past glory. They had more than 60,000 visitors this year with interesting keynotes, lots of panels and such. Many companies use this occasion to push through a lot of exciting announcements. And as usual, the Mobile World Congress news cycle started a couple of weeks before the show and continued till even few days after the show. Of course, there were tons of very interesting announcements. Metaverse, VRAN, Open RAN, private networks were some of the key network related themes from the show. And Samsung Networks, which is the cellular infrastructure arm of giant Samsung conglomerate, had lots of announcements at the event as well. These included significant collaborations, global vRAN and Open RAN launches, private networks traction, and others. I've written a couple of articles on these announcements, which I'll include in the description of the podcast. Please do check them out if you need more details. But to go even deeper and behind these announcements, we have a special guest with us today, with whom I'll discuss the significance of these announcements to Samsung as well as to the larger industry as such. And that is Derek Johnston, who is head of marketing and business development at Samsung Networks. Derek, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Prakash. I really appreciate it.
All right. So, Derek, I think you've been with Samsung Networks for close to 6 years now, right? Probably you started when many people in the US didn't even know that Samsung had an infra business. Could you briefly give us your background and your journey within Samsung?
Wow. Yes. Yeah, Prakash, you have a better memory than I do. Yeah, I think you're right. It's been about 6 years. And yes, I would also agree that many folks, embarrassingly, including myself, didn't know much about Samsung's network infrastructure business at the time. Mine was a bit contextual. I didn't really know the extent to their participation in the network's technology business. But I joined. As you know, it was a very interesting time, and I came from doing a few years at Corning, where I led the marketing team that addressed kind of their global wireless business, which was focused on in-building wireless infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
And they had acquired Mobile Access Networks, which was a firm that I joined in around, I think, maybe 2008-ish or so. That was at an inflection point where kind of investors in that company had wanted to grow the business rapidly and then sell. And so, my role varied, in terms of the marketing from a very, very targeted audiences, if you will, from outside companies to pitch the company to growing the business. And so, so I stayed with Corning for a few years, and then joined their development efforts, and then launched their fiber-based DAS. And then after accomplishing that commercial launch, I found the opportunity at Samsung, and it's been an incredible, interesting, and kind of fulfilling experience. They were leading 5G development at the time, and I kind of joined right at the time when we were pitching and demonstrating to U.S. operators, particularly in the millimeter wave space. It's been a wild journey.
Indeed. So before we go on to the Mobile World Congress announcements, a couple of questions on Samsung Network's meteoric rise in the US. For somebody not in the know, it might seem like very sudden and even surprising, but I'm sure a lot of work got into winning those contracts, from major operators like Verizon, which prides itself about its network. What are some of the biggest reasons behind that win and continued success after that?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So I think why some folks in the industry may have viewed our commercial momentum in 5G as sudden, is due in part to what has been kind of a patient and deliberate approach to the network technology market that Samsung has taken.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, folks have to remember that Samsung has been in this market for over 4 years. So, I joined 6 years ago. A part of my role that I really enjoyed was learning about Samsung's history and journey across the network technology as well as other markets. And then telling the story of how we arrived here. But I think to get to your question on the specifics in terms of what has resonated with operators, from my perspective, I think the reason why the leadership at, a technology forward operator like Verizon chose to collaborate with us on their 4G, 5G networks is first and foremost our, technology leadership and our ability to design, deliver, and deploy it.
Mm.
And I think the second portion, which is a little bit more, kind of in the intangible side, is, our people and the, kind of this collective, relentless customer focused approach that we take. I characterize it as an entrepreneurial kind of attitude combined with, the discipline and experience of a large company that has, driven part of that success, to date, in my opinion.
Very well. I think you embraced Open RAN and vRAN much more openly, pun intended, than your traditional competitors, and I think that makes perfect sense because you're not as much entrenched in them, and in fact, this provides an excellent opportunity for you to compete, right? So, what is your view on the prospect of Open RAN in the Americas? I mean, I'll talk about Europe a little bit later, but in US and Canada, how do you see that panning out?
Sure. Yeah, Open RAN, is an interesting topic, especially at the moment for a lot of reasons.
Mm-hmm.
The one rather tricky element of Open RAN has been the politics of the technology and the approach, both internally within the industry. I mean, you kind of sit squarely in this space, right?
Yeah.
And externally with global market dynamics and security concerns. So I don't really necessarily want to touch on either of these, but all of this to say is yes, we have embraced Open RAN. We embrace Open RAN, and the reason why is because years ago, operators started to express this interest and a desire to open interfaces in the RAN and introduce new vendors and feature capabilities. And as a practical matter, as you noted, when we don't have an incumbent position with operators like we did with many of the U.S. operators. Open RAN does provide an opportunity. So we have advanced Open RAN here in the U.S. And have done so across multiple operators, as you're aware of. We see it as a viable and strong approach for network operators that want the flexibility that Open RAN offers.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in North America, I think Open RAN today has been, what I would call successful in its progress and will continue to grow and be successful. I think that the most important thing is we acknowledge that it's not for all network operators. We do not see this as a singular choice or, you're either with it or against it. We acknowledge that it's a choice that network operators need to make, and that we will continue to develop and deploy traditional RAN and continue to advocate for our industry-leading virtualized RAN and any combination of these network technologies or approaches that the customer may want to employ, or I should say deploy with their network.
Okay. Well, yeah, I think, I mean, it's a lot of hype around it, but it's still a long way to go. And it's still the traditional RAN will still, grow and expand during that time.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And after Verizon in the US, you had more deals, selected deals as such in the Americas. So what is your overall strategy in terms of, growth and expansion in the region?
Yeah, I think for our U.S. business, our North America business and growth strategy, we have, I think, first and foremost, our focus has been, and it's been this relentless focus, is on our current commercial customers and delivering, best in class solutions to them. We believe that your customers do the best bit of selling for you. So the more that we can make those network operators successful, and those network operators talking about the things that they're doing with their advanced networks, the more that the success will follow, right?
Mm-hmm.
The second piece, I think, of our growth strategy really focuses on this collaborative and customer centric approach, which means that meeting the customers where they are in their network journey. So in the U.S., that as the network operators take a very different view in terms of, call it traditional RAN, virtualized RAN, and Open RAN. There's a varied approach, and so the one area that we've been able to lean into is supporting all of those different types of architectural approaches and the technologies behind them.
Mm-hmm.
So we have the solutions in those three various approaches and technologies. And if there's a mutual fit to working together, then we work hard to earn their trust and, build their network. And then the third portion is in kind of new growth areas. We've sought and acknowledge that, we need partnerships in certain cases in those newer markets, because we may not either have the complete solution stack, the expertise, or the market access. And so we've sought to partner in those areas. And so, that's things like you've seen where, in private networks, we've
Mm-hmm.
gone with channel partners, or we've, sought the assistance of some other technology or transport layer folks where we don't have certain parts of that technology stack, like our partnership with Sienna. And so, you've seen that in some of our recent announcements and commercial deals. So that's the third aspect, so.
Absolutely. I think the transport part is becoming, very important as we move forward with a lot of virtualization happening and such. It hasn't gotten that much of attention yet, but I think pretty soon it'll get the attention it deserves, especially when you have distributed networks with virtualization across the board and so on. So I think your collaboration with Sienna is pretty important and significant in that respect. So now let's move on to Europe. Europe, I think it's a large region with a lot of variability in many countries with unique opportunities and their own challenges. It seems Open RAN is kind of a real trump card for you guys in the region. What do you think? How is your strategy there?
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail right on the head, Prakash. I think in Europe, it has been in a region that we traditionally, admittedly, we don't have a large footprint.
Mm-hmm.
My colleagues in Europe have been grinding away with a lot of the European operators, showcasing, particularly when we were coming out with 5G technology, showcasing our capabilities, and our contributions to 5G development. It did not necessarily translate into, a lot of success in terms of broad commercial deals. And I think now, with Open RAN and the fact that we had prior to the regulatory and security concerns in that region, had jumped into Open RAN and had done early work in terms of advancing, our technology and advancing the ecosystem and the specifications and participating with the Open RAN Alliance.
Mm-hmm.
I think as it started to pay dividends, and we're starting to see it in terms of some of the recent announcements and the progress that we made with Vodafone UK and so and with Orange with the lab. And so I think it's the Open RAN engagement that we've had with the industry, and the fact that we, unlike, I think, when you look at the Open RAN community, I feel like we have a unique offering in terms of,
Mm-hmm.
we are the one player, if you will, that is not a, what I would call, top global network infrastructure. I mean, we're not one or two in the market. And so we don't have a lot of incumbency in various markets,
Mm-hmm.
and we have the depth and breadth of the portfolio, from core
Yeah.
to the radio side, and also we have the leadership in virtualized RAN in terms of the software chops that I think serve us well, even in the Open RAN space, that make it unique in terms of our ability to support an Open RAN approach. So I think there's a lot more to come, I think, for us in Europe. I'm excited about it. Particularly for my colleagues over there that have been working hard to address those collaborations with the European operators.
Very nice. So, talking about this announcement that you mentioned with Vodafone launching the first commercial Open RAN site there, how did that come about, and why launching one single site is that important and that noteworthy?
Right. It's kind of funny, because I think if you're not, if you're outside of the industry, you're like, wow, really?
Yeah.
Your reaction might have been a little bit less than excitement, but it was a big moment in the industry. I think specifically,
Uh-huh.
in Europe, and the dynamics as we were talking about. I would definitely have to defer to my colleagues about how it came about, if you will, as well as a future relationship. But
Uh-huh.
I do know that we are looking forward to continuing the collaboration with Vodafone, and that they've got almost, I think, a few thousand sites that they plan to deploy that we're looking to support them with. And so I think that's really exciting, and I think it'll be it's a large proof point, and will be as we continue to commercially grow with. And so I think that will be significant for us, just in terms of, I think, the ongoing engagements that we have with the European operators, and will serve us well, I think, in other markets where Open RAN is important.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand. I'm wondering, your expansion in Europe will not be just limited to Open RAN itself, right? It could be in the legacy model as well, because it will take some time for all the operators to move on to Open RAN as such, isn't it?
Right. I think, specifically as it relates to legacy solutions, I can say this: we will, look to support our customers with their legacy networks for those, who need or require it, and where it kind of makes sense. Again, there's obviously plans in which to sunset some of those legacy, like some of the legacy network infrastructure, and then there's a need to support it for a certain, amount of time. I think specifically as it relates to supporting those legacy networks, and where we're deploying our virtualized RAN solutions, Samsung will be equipped with the capabilities to support the operators in their migration from, with this complex mix of the prior generations like 2G, 4G, with 5G, to a unified and simplified kind of overarching network architecture.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's safe to say that we obviously understand the need for it. We've got customers that are particularly with a software approach, a virtualized approach, that those capabilities are going to be needed and warranted for us to support for those customers.
Mm-hmm. And in staying on the same vRAN and Open RAN theme, at Mobile World Congress, you made this announcement of broad coalition with representatives from cloud, enterprise, chipset, and all the parts of the ecosystem itself. Could you tell me about what is the significance, what is the ultimate objective of that coalition?
Sure. Yeah, we saw the need to join with these technology leaders to expand the 5G vRAN ecosystem for driving kind of innovation,
Mhm.
in the specifically in the vRAN market. So Dell, HPE, Intel, Red Hat, I think Wind River, were all part of that particular announcement. So I think basically what we're saying is, look, we've kind of tested and validated interoperability with each company platform.
Mm-hmm.
So we want to make sure that we've got this comprehensive view of the network evolution, every step of the kind of development process, from a deployment and a management perspective. And then
Mm-hmm.
I think we're looking for the ecosystem to be to say, okay, well, we're all rowing in the same direction in terms of preparation for commercial deployments. So for network operators and folks that are deploying networks, the various activities like getting into the lab, aligning on the solution roadmaps, addressing updates in terms of kind of software updates and things like that, and fostering kind of a fully interoperable approach. On the vRAN portion, we just wanted to say, okay, look, we've agreed on the process. We've gone through these, testing and interoperability certification, if you will, and we're all aligned, and this is kind of commercially ready, if you will. So that's the objective there.
So is it only looking at interop, or are you looking at doing more stuff in the future with this coalition? One thing I can think of is, which is still a major challenge right now for Open RAN, is overarching management system which connects with all the different parts of the network. Anything of that sort in the making, or it's primarily only for interop?
Right. I think in terms of the ecosystem, I can't speak to specifics kind of beyond what we've
Mm.
announced. I think the intention, though, is, and I can speak to this specifically, is where it makes sense with the ecosystem members to go deeper than interoperability testing and to drive more innovation, or kind of seamless deployment or network management approaches, as you were suggesting.
Uh-huh.
We're absolutely looking to do so and are doing so. So I think there's absolutely an ability to do that. I just can't speak to whether or not in terms of the, governance of the ecosystem, if we've, if that portion has been kind of outlined, but I know that the spirit of it, the intention is to do so, and specifically the concept of going deeper with ecosystem members where it makes sense, to do things, more on a roadmap basis is certainly there.
Okay. And do you expect more vendors or even operators to join this group or?
Yes, absolutely. Because you'll obviously it was not necessarily complete from the particular players in the space, or in certain categories, as you had mentioned, kind of certain categories of different folks in terms of the technology stack. So
Mhm.
yes, there's absolutely an intention to expand the ecosystem. In fact, there is work being done by Samsung with folks that were outside of the ecosystem mentioned that I would anticipate joining the ecosystem at some point.
Okay, very well. So now changing subject, another market that has huge potential, private networks. You touched on it a little bit earlier. So you had this couple of announcements at Mobile World Congress. The first one was about the deployment at Howard University. This was, I think, a little bit before Mobile World Congress. Tell us about that, because there is this notion that of the 5G private networks are for this URLLC industries and others, but I think there's a lot of value in using even simple enhanced mobile broadband for, say, universities and other such campuses and so on. Tell us more about this deployment and what are some of the use cases they're looking at, and how is it going?
Yeah, thank you, Raj. It's a really interesting start to, I think, with the private network space. And for us, Howard University came to us through a relationship with Amdocs that we've recently announced as well.
Mm,
They have obviously a unique set of capabilities. The one area that we're currently focused them on is more of collaboration in the kind of the enterprise private network space. They have a
mm-hmm,
particular set of verticals. Education, higher ed happen to be one of those verticals where they have kind of expertise and market access to. And so with Howard University, we've deployed a CBRS based, kind of what I call 5G ready network for Howard. Their,
mm-hmm,
I think, immediate use case in phase one, as you noted, was mainly, around enhanced mobile broadband.
mm-hmm,
It's primarily phase one is really just a focus on outdoor coverage. And so if you think about it, really was largely it's providing access to students, faculty, any, visitors to the campus to provide them with broadband service. So again, that would be largely PC, and you want to tether it to, they can kind of convert it into Wi-Fi, or they can, if they've got a CBRS based device, they can use, and access the network, but it's mainly to enable broadband services across it. And then, I think the university, again, just not to speak on their behalf, but has identified other potential use cases, things like point of sale, kind of kiosks and digital signage, things of this nature will enable, better, not, security, but also access to services and things like that for the student body and faculty and visitors.
mm-hmm.
So it's an interesting use case, and I think the university systems, I think, will look, while CBRS and, in general, the spectrum availability and the ability to, its propagation advantages that it has over kind of an outdoor Wi-Fi network or things of that nature, and capabilities that they get to do with it. Not only that, I'm trying to bring some of that stuff indoors. I think it's going to be very interesting to see where they go from there, because there are a lot of, distance learning applications and things, as you know, that become available with that network and the capabilities, even if the university wants to do it in specific, buildings and areas, hotspots, if you will, across their campuses. So it's a lot of potential there.
Uh-huh, I see. And you also had a couple of interesting fixed wireless access announcements at Mobile World Congress, particularly the one with Avista Edge was interesting, when you're using the existing utility infrastructure to provide broadband access. Could you tell us more about that?
Yes, yeah, this one is very, very interesting to me. Avista Edge is basically new company that came out of Vista, and Vista Edge has got this concept and go to market approach as well as a technology
Mm-hmm.
that they're offering. Effectively, a CPE that fits onto the electrical utility meter, and
Mm-hmm.
we've been collaborating with them on the network infrastructure. Over their existing
Mm-hmm.
electrical utility, like local electrical utilities, like for example, the trial that we did with them, where Vista Edge comes in, they've got the CPE, but they've also are kind of packaging this up.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the go-to-market for the electrical utility, and provides those electrical utilities with an opportunity to
Mm-hmm.
serve these rural, underserved markets, or not even served markets, so they can bring broadband to their end users. And so it's an interesting go-to-market and use case, I think, to close the digital divide, particularly in rural areas. And their focus is those rural electrical service providers. I think they're called PUPs. Yeah, and I think it's a fascinating business model, and I think it's going to be an interesting
Mm-hmm.
player as we talk about the kind of rural broadband divide, or the rural broadband initiatives to close the digital divide out there.
And that is on CBRS spectrum as well, or?
Correct. Yes.
Okay. CBRS was a little bit slow to take off, but I think it is going everywhere. It has tons of opportunities. I think we'll see rapid growth this year and next year, especially with 5G coming in and with fixed wireless access becoming a key use case for 5G.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's going to be a really interesting, interesting year for CBRS for sure.
Sure. I think we can keep talking for hours together on these subjects, but I think we covered a lot of ground as such. Any final comments or any major things that we missed from your Mobile World Congress activities and the announcements you did there?
No, I think I think we cover. I agree. We covered a lot of ground. I think it's this has been a great journey, and it's always a pleasure to discuss this with experts like yourself, Prakash. Yeah, no, I'm very excited. I think our focus, as we kind of alluded to, we spent a lot of time talking about ORAN, has been on our vRAN leadership, and just ensuring that for operators globally that are looking to take a virtualized approach to their RAN, they give us a call, because I think we've got the commercial experience, the breadth, definitely the technology leadership, and as I said, the commercial success to deliver. And so I think this year is going to be an interesting and pivotal year for us in that space, and so I'm looking forward to it, and I'm happy to be here and chat with you. It's I really appreciate the opportunity.
All right. Thank you very much for all the information and insights. A lot of exciting stuff happening on 5G and Open RAN and private networks front. I really appreciate you coming on to Tantra's Mantra. Hope to see you back soon on the show. So, folks, that's all for now. I hope it was informative and you found this to be useful. If you did, please hit that subscribe button down there. I'll be back very soon with another episode, putting light on another interesting subject. Bye bye for now.